Forum. We're going to be talking about process safety culture, and we're really lucky to have Caroline Dennett with us. Charlie is going to join us, but we're having some technical issues, but hopefully we'll be able to figure those out and he can join and present. As before, we've got 3 minutes until the start of the event, so I'm just going to run through some of the ground rules so that we all are on the same page. So remember, this session is being streamed live to YouTube. That includes the chat and Facebook, and will be available for playback on the YouTube channel. So just be mindful and respectful with what you say in the chat and what we're discussing here. Also, just remember that everybody who's on this call is giving their time for free. So that's both the people who are participating and Caroline, myself, and Charlie. So please just be respectful when you're asking questions or demanding of our time. The technical setup. So hopefully you can all hear me. I'll start to do a test in a minute with the chat. But the best results are using Chrome or the app on your phone. If you're using Microsoft Edge or Safari, you may have some problems. Let us know in the chat if you can hear us. So I can see Charlie is coming back that the sound is good. We'll do a test with Caroline in a minute. There's a Q&A function available. When you type it in the chat box, you'll have a little write message option or a question mark option. If you have a question at any time, just type your question in. If you use the question mark option, it allows me to project it onto the screen so everybody can see it. So that's the best. And then please provide the feedback afterwards so that we can keep making these better and better. So Charlie's confirmed that he can hear us. Can anyone else confirm that they can hear me? And then can you also confirm that you can see the screen? And then Carolina, if you just say a little something.
Yeah, good evening, everyone.
Can you hear Caroline as well? Yeah, great. And Jill's just tested out this Q&A function. So I'll show you what it looks like. If we go here. So Jill, when you use the Q&A, this is how it comes up. So that's why we ask you to use the Q&A. Great. So Caroline's sound is perfect as well. Okay, well, it's 8 o'clock, so we're going to get on with the event now. So as I said, we're here for our 4th Process Safety Forum. Time has really flown. And this week, we're really lucky to be joined by Caroline, and we're going to be discussing process safety culture. And we're just going to answer any questions you have. So the format for the meeting, as with the others, is we start now at 8 o'clock. I'll give a quick introduction to myself. Caroline will give an introduction, and then she'll give a quick introduction to the topic. And then about 10 past, we'll open the floor for questions and sharing. So again, just be mindful when you're sharing that everything that you share will be available for replay on YouTube. So make sure that you are permitted to share what you share. And then about 5 minutes before we finish, I will wrap up and I will announce next week's topic. So a quick introduction. So for those of you who have attended before, apologies, but my name is Louise Whiting. And I have worked for over 11 years in operating companies, Shell and BP. And I've now set up my own company, and I've founded these events with Charlie so that we can try to share our process safety knowledge with those who maybe are not working in the environments we've worked before. So I'm also going to give an introduction to Charlie. So Charlie is on as an attendee because we're having some difficulties getting him to join as a presenter. But Charlie has over 20 years working with Total, and he now works as an independent consultant. And he is founded Process Safety Management 101 training, and he also has a process safety tool. And we've been working together to try and share process safety knowledge and make sure everybody gets home safe. Caroline, if you take the floor now.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So my name is Caroline Dennett. I have a business intelligence and kind of business consultancy called Clout Limited. I've been in the kind of research game for about 20 years, predominantly in creating insights around kind of consumer markets. But in the second half of my research career, this has been focused very heavily on understanding the drivers of human behaviour, motivation and change, and particularly around safety cultures. I've been running safety culture assessments, mostly in the form of surveys in the oil and gas industry for about the last 8 or 9 years. So I have considerable experience now in exploring and examining and reporting on various safety cultures, including process safety culture.
Thank you, Caroline. So I'll let you give a quick introduction to process safety culture now. You've got the slides, and then after that, we'll open the floor for questions. If you have any questions in the meantime, remember, just type them in using the question button, and we'll be able to put them up after Caroline's finished speaking.
Many thanks, Louise. So yeah, I would just like to take a few minutes to talk about safety culture, and we'll zoom in on process safety culture as well. So really, what do we mean by safety culture? So I guess a textbook definition would be the attitudes, values, beliefs and behaviours that underpin the way we do things around here. Now, sometimes you may hear that referred to as the human factors or the soft skills in safety management. When we talk about it within an organisation, we might say, well, it's our collective commitment to doing the right thing. And I guess when we come down to the individual level, to the operator level, to the people at the front line, we'd probably be better off describing it as it's just what we do and how we act when no one is watching. And by no one is watching is we're not being supervised. It's what happens when we're on a night shift. It's what happens when we're in the dark end of the plant. So how do we act and how do we behave when no one's around to tell us to behave in a different way? So we might also ask, why is it important to understand safety culture and indeed process safety culture? So many studies have shown that there is a direct link between safety performance and safety culture, and exactly the same thing is true for process safety performance and process safety culture. And what we've seen is that nearly all process safety incidents have some kind of root cause that's attributed to human behaviours. And by that we mean how people interact with the systems, controls, processes and barriers that are present in any given organisation. And historically, the industry has not been very good at tackling the human behaviour side of things. So if we typically look at a large organisation, we can see that probably around about 75% of all incidents, safety incidents, can probably have their root in attitudes, behaviours and values, and then probably around about 20% in processes and 5% in structures. But if we look at how we deal with those causes, most actions to resolve those issues are actually targeted the other way around. So we see that there are around 60% of targeted actions will be at the structures, about 35% at processes, and really just a small amount, around about 5%, actually attempt to target the attitudes, behaviours and values with a solution. So what we can understand is that a system fix alone will not help. The temptation, especially in engineering companies, is to put in a system fix, put in another barrier, write another procedure, put in a process. But actually that won't really help when people are the cause, because often people are just unaware, unsure, they may be unprepared, they might be under pressure or under-resourced, and we can't fix people in the same way that we can fix a system or a process. People need to be nurtured and encouraged and motivated. So why would we want to measure a process safety culture? Well, there are several reasons for doing that. And one of them is to connect the leadership in any given organisation to the realities on the ground. So quite often we see that there are big differences in perception between leadership teams and how they perceive a process safety culture, and then how people on the front line, or people in different groups, people in engineering, people in HSE teams. And it really helps leadership to shine a light in the dark corners of their organisation. So those places where perhaps they they don't go very often. They don't go there often enough, and there can be some surprises from that. It really helps identify the leading indicators on process safety performance. So it's not predictive as such, but it can help us understand where are those gaps that often lead to those incidents that sadly occur all too often. And it helps us to then focus attention on those gaps. But not just that, it helps us to understand what our strengths are, our strengths in our culture, that we can then recognise those and celebrate those and use those to build on momentum and to maintain them. It also helps us to support efficient improvement planning and targeted intervention. So rather than just put your finger in the air and think, oh, that feels to us like that should be improved, it can give some evidence around what needs to be improved, and you can set yourself on a course towards progression by being very targeted. And that leads on to the last thing, which is it can ensure effective allocation of scarce resources. So again, instead of taking a scattergun approach, you can pump the few resources that you might have to improve safety culture into a very specific area. So for example, if you had only 100 units of effort, and however that effort is, whether it's in terms of budget or resources, how would you spend that 100 units? And it can help if you can measure your process safety culture kind of scientifically. It can help you to say that's where we need to put our resources, and you make sure that you get the most bang for your buck in that respect. And then just finally, what does it take? Well, it takes three things in my view. It probably takes more than three things, but these are the three of the most important things. Courage. It definitely takes courage to measure your process safety culture. What we often see is that leadership is a key driver of process safety culture perception. So that's one of the key things that really drive the culture either forward or backwards, actually. And for leadership teams who are brave enough to undertake a process safety culture assessment, it can be really challenging to know what people really think. And that is only about people's perceptions, but it can be difficult to hear some of those messages that come back from the front line about how they perceive leadership teams behave. And that does take some, I have to say, it's some balls sometimes to really, sit up and listen to that. And it takes commitment as well. So an understanding that if you set out on this path to understanding your process safety culture, that it's not just for today. It's not something you do as a fancy or a whim. It's going to require consistent, long-term, possibly indefinite or infinite focus. And it also requires care. So as I mentioned a moment ago, people need to be nurtured, culture needs to be nurtured, and there needs to be genuine concern for people and plant and planet. And by that, I mean the environment in which you operate. And that concern not just needs to be genuine, but it needs to be felt as well. People really need to feel that, and they need to see it as well. So really, yeah, those three things are probably the key ingredients that you need in order to go on the process safety culture assessment journey. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks, Caroline. So I'll open with a question while we let people type. So I know that you have worked with a lot of sites and you've had repeat visits. What have you seen work really well in improving people's culture, and what things have you seen where people have put a lot of effort in and maybe it just, it didn't really have the impact that they'd maybe hoped? Could you give us an example of each?
Yeah, indeed. So what works really well, I think, in the first instance is communicating the results of the survey. So if you undertake a survey, is really to share that so that people feel rewarded in some way for taking part, that they feel that they've been listened to, they feel they've been taken serious, and they feel engaged and involved in the solutions as well. So that is a good first step. I think it is where there has been a very targeted action plan put in place, so things aren't just left to drift, with people allocated responsibility. So I think those things work really well, and the more people that you can engage, at the front line, so that leadership isn't just something that happens at the top of the tree, but is something that happens throughout the organisation, I think that helps really well. The worst thing that you can do is is to do nothing, without a doubt. And we have seen, when we've done repeat surveys in companies where really very little was done with the results of the survey, that can be devastating for the safety culture. Make no bones about that. You can see results next time absolutely drop through the floor, because people were asked to participate, they went to the effort, they did that, they had an expectation that things were going to change, and then nothing changed. And in some respects, that's worse. It's worse to do nothing, having asked people for their contribution, than to have not asked them at all and let things stay as they are. So yeah, I think doing nothing is the worst thing. It's rarely the case that doing something makes anything worse. You know, you may not be as effective as you could be, but almost doing something. So there's kind of like 3 tiers actually. So there's doing nothing will probably see you drop your positive perceptions. There's kind of like doing something that is not necessarily structured, but where you may improve communication, for example. There's a kind of just an emphasis more on process safety. That will help. The best thing you can do is to have something that's quite structured, that's tracked, that's communicated, that people can feel a part of. That will definitely see results pushing forward.
Excellent. So we've had a few questions come through. I'll put the first one up. So this is from Jill. Are the metrics different for measuring process safety culture versus occupational safety culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. We measure 2 things mostly. Either our assessments have a very process safety culture focus, or they have what you may be calling there, Jill, occupational safety. We might just call general safety or operational safety. So just not focusing on processes and interaction between people and the process safety barriers. Yes, they are slightly different metrics that we use. So the process safety assessment tends to be much more geared towards some of the technical elements, much more geared towards risk assessments, understanding the interactions with the processes, with the barriers, MOC, things like that. Whereas in the kind of general safety culture assessment, it tries to measure much more the underlying organisational values, much more focused on the even softer side of safety culture.
Okay, and then Charlie's given us a question. Why still is it difficult for companies to understand the importance about working on its safety culture? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like what I mentioned a moment ago. I think especially in the heavy industries, it's so tempting just to come up with an engineering solution or a technical solution or a process solution rather than look at the underlying behavioral issues or the underlying values and attitudes. That feels hard. It feels hard for people. It feels hard for people in general, I think, because there's a relationship element within that. That's awkward. It can feel really, really awkward, and especially in a culture that's not very progressed, where it isn't very open. So we know from results that we've seen that often things like being open and honest with each other, you know, that's quite hard for people. We might not think it day to day. Yeah, we talk to our colleagues and everything's fine, but actually, do we really have those difficult conversations that we need to have? So I think there's a general awkwardness, reluctance to talk about those softer issues that make a culture. So I think that's one of the issues. It's much easier for people, especially I say in organisations that are very engineering focused, that are very technically focused, and it's particularly in the oil and gas industry, it can be difficult. You know, there's not much training around that. People aren't skilled in having their eye on those softer things, and I think that's often what happens in leadership teams, that those soft skills that we talk about, they're not that there's no training given around that, and therefore, you know, sometimes the leadership teams unintentionally message the wrong thing. They may unintentionally behave in a way that sends the wrong message, and I think that's why it's difficult for companies to understand the importance of safety culture, because people find it difficult as a subject. Dealing with behaviours and attitudes and values is much harder than dealing with systems and processes.
Yeah, I think also, Caroline, I'll add there, sometimes it's difficult to admit that you are the part of the problem. It's much easier to say, oh, well, there wasn't enough engineering barriers, because that's completely, it's not blaming yourself. Even if you could say that you made a mistake and there wasn't enough barriers, it's still not really blaming yourself, right? But when you have to say that the way that you communicate or the way that you interact with people is driving poor behavior, that's quite a difficult thing to do. And so there's that one. And then the other one is that people, as you said, people just don't really talk openly about things. And especially I found process safety, some people don't understand it enough to have conversations about it. Yeah. So they just avoid it. Yeah, it's like the nappy discussions with mums and dads. You know, dads just don't want to talk about, mums know everything about it. So yeah, if you don't understand it, it's often difficult to have that discussion, to try and have those open ones, and people think you don't want to hear about it. I've got another question from Charlie. Can you share your secret formula to make decision makers understand we need to invest in our process safety culture and move forward?
Secret formulas. I mean, I suppose there's a spectrum really of formulas that run from, you know, something very easy to that's softer. I guess just that, you know, it's better for everyone. You know, from a productivity point of view, when people are very engaged, that you know, having a good process safety culture isn't just good for safety, it's good for productivity as well. So there's a kind of angle around that it can help in those ways. But, you know, at the very brutal end, saying, you know, if you think a process safety, if you think progressing your process safety culture is hard, try an incident, because that is a lot harder to deal with. And really, you know, if you don't sort out your process safety culture, because of this massive correlation between process safety culture and process safety performance, you know, somewhere along the line you could be heading for a disaster that you are utterly unprepared for. At least by measuring your process safety culture, you do have those leading indicators. You have some early warning signs that can really help you prevent you know, more near misses, but also prevent small incidents and top events as well. And I think that's, you know, for us, that's really been the hook, I think, is to say, well, look, you know, it does help. It's not just there for the sake of measuring it. It has real outcomes, and you really do learn. As uncomfortable as it is, you really do learn about what is going on at the front line, and what people think of your leadership as well.
Yeah, and I suppose half of the problem is knowing where to improve, right? If you don't know what you need to fix, you can't fix. Yeah. So I have one more question from Charlie, and then I've got another two after that. Can you mention some of the tools you normally apply for this kind of assessment?
Yeah, so in our particular toolbox, we've got two or three surveys that range from extremely detailed. The process safety culture survey that we developed is it's very detailed. It probably takes about 20 to 25 minutes for the average respondent to take that survey. But it is worth it, I think, because it really gets to the bottom of things. It's got kind of like laser accuracy in terms of what it will deliver. And I think also the benefit of that tool is it often acts as a short bit of training for people, actually. So for people who either don't have a very good idea of what process safety is, never mind process safety culture, but process safety, or are a bit doubtful about their own knowledge, just the nature of that survey really helps people to understand what we mean by process safety and what a good process safety culture looks like. So it's quite helpful in that respect. But it will definitely uncover everything you didn't want to know about your process safety culture. And we have a general safety culture survey, which is similar in structure and style and analytics, but is focused on slightly different attributes and elements of safety culture. And then we do also have a much smaller, very simple process safety leadership survey. So it won't measure your process safety culture, but it will measure the most driving element of process safety culture that we have found, which is process safety leadership. And that isn't just focused, again, on the top of the house. So it doesn't just ask people to evaluate leadership teams. It also asks people for their opinion on supervision and supervisors, but also about their own responsibilities and their own personal leadership and process safety. So although it's very short, that one's only about 5 or 6 minutes long, it's a kind of 360-degree assessment of process safety leadership in all its definition of leadership.
Excellent. And you mentioned before we were on the session that there were a couple of areas. So this is one of the areas which really impacts the process safety culture, is the leadership, right? If you get this wrong, even if you have other good elements, the process safety culture can be compromised.
Yeah, indeed. But if I can expand on that, actually, because what we tend to see is, in the best process safety cultures that we've ever assessed, what happens is that everyone really does believe that safety is central to work activities, and everyone takes responsibility for that. So people will have pride in their work, they feel kind of happy, although they're still alert, they're not complacent, they're alert, they're risk aware, they're cooperative, they communicate, they're courageous, they will speak out, they will raise their hand. And as long as leaders kind of are consistent in that and that they care, but sort of like the leadership team are no longer leading that safety culture because it lives in the organization. So it's almost like in those cultures that we've found that leadership is not such a strong driver then, because it's almost it's not surplus to requirement, but it's doing what it needs to do. It's not being flagged because everyone is taking responsibility and things are working really well. What we tend to see is in safety cultures which are less developed than leadership or process safety leadership in the if we're looking at process safety, that's much more in focus, because people are looking to leaders still to show the way, to drive the culture forward. So that's what we tend to see. Yeah, in safety cultures which are less progressed, the emphasis on leadership is stronger.
Okay. I've got another question here. Some safety culture initiatives are overshadowed by production and financial needs. Can you suggest how to overcome this obstacle? What have you seen work?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in almost all the companies where we have done the surveys, they are under pressure, in terms of production and financial pressures, and we've seen that increasingly in the last 4 years. I should think since 2016, when the oil price took a real real downward fall. So we've seen that. Overcoming it, that is hard. So we do see trends. We have tended to see that in more recent times, some cultures that we would expect to do quite well are not, and people raise the issue of production and financial targets, and that becomes very, very apparent. So people are very aware of that, and that is a difficult balance. And I think the leadership teams in those organizations know that it's a very difficult balance. I think what really helps is that leaders make sure they're very clear about the messages that they give, because it's very easy for people to hear it's production, it's saving, it's cost saving, it's get it done as quickly as we can. And I think the natural state in any in any industry really, but in any industry that needs to make a profit for shareholders, is to get the job done. People come to work to get the job done, to do a job, produce what they're producing, operate on what they need to operate on, and go home. And that's the natural state, that's the natural state to be in. And in some respects, kind of like process safety and safety focus, it kind of disrupts that, it disrupts that natural state. It disrupts that need to just drive operation and drive production and meet financial targets. And what safety culture needs to do is to change the natural state so that the natural state is towards safe production and safe operations, and that it doesn't have to compromise. That becomes central to everything. We aren't just about producing and making profits. We have to do that in a safe way, and I think that's how we can turn it on its head really and say, yeah, those two things are absolutely must go together. Because actually the biggest price you pay is when things go wrong, because that's really expensive, right? That's far more expensive than slowing down a little bit, being a bit more aware of the risks that you're facing, mitigating those risks. That's cheaper than an incident, which will, devastate companies' bottom line and their reputation as well.
Yeah, I have seen where we made a change in our safety culture. But the way that we did that was, as you said, aligning with the production and financial needs rather than trying to fight them. We aligned with them, and we helped influence decisions in a risk-based manner. So making sure that when those key decision makers were making decisions, they knew the risks associated with those. And then the thing that you said there was communicating. So not only communicating that this is the decision we've made, we say, well, this is the decision we've made, and this is how we got there. We've considered the risks associated with this, and on balance, this is how we are going to go. Yeah. So, yeah, definitely agree that those are the things that helped us change our culture a bit, was being clear and then aligning with the natural state, as you said, but supporting it with the risk-based decisions. We've got a question from Matthias. What advice can you give to increase the safety culture in a greenfield project? Of course, in the future, process safety training for white and blue collars, but what can be done to increase awareness among people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And whilst that might be difficult in terms of process safety, in terms of just kind of general safety culture, I mean, we do safety culture assessments in all kinds of industries, and not just in the highest risk or in those that are already producing. So we have successfully done those safety culture surveys in new projects, in construction projects, in non-oil and gas sectors as well. So really it's the same, and it's about starting out with what are your safety goals and objectives. What are you trying to create? What are you willing to tolerate? What are you not willing to tolerate? And being very, very clear with people about what that is. And I think, if we go back to, yes, the natural state, isn't the natural state for us all isn't to be in a safety culture. It's to just do, to just get on and do it. So it does take some effort. But I think with consistent messages, be very clear about what your expectations are. And I think that extends to when you're working with third parties, with contractor partners, especially on sites where you've got a lot of different trades potentially, or a lot of different people coming in and out that are not directly employed by yourself. That is often where we see there are some tensions, because the host company may well have a very different approach to safety than those of contractors coming onto site, or who may be semi-permanently on site for a long time, and that can be very difficult. But again, being very clear, having very good induction training courses where you make it very clear what your expectations are, how you want people to behave, and also to ask them, about their experience and what concerns do they have. I think having some kind of engagement really helps.
Yeah, I think I've also found in projects it can be quite tricky to get the process safety part right, even though that this is the point in the life of the facility where we can have the biggest impact on process safety is during the project. But often the focus is on schedule and cost. And then the third focus, when people talk about safety, they talk a lot about the construction safety, because that's considered part of the project, right? And actual process safety happens once we start putting things in. So that's not part of project anymore. That's part of operations. So that's what I found in these project teams, is that there's a lot of focus on cost, schedule, and occupational construction safety, and there's not that much on process safety. But what I found to work well is just reminding the engineers what they are responsible for and what they will be liable for if something goes wrong in the operate phase. They are responsible for ensuring the standards are applied, and just asking those sort of open questions when you get to decision gates. So which international standard did we apply here? Did you have any difficulties applying any of them? It starts to get people thinking, well, the management are going to ask these questions. I better have answers. So I better have checked what the standard said, because sometimes you just do what you did before on the last project, assuming that the last project had the most up-to-date standard and you did everything correctly. But that's not necessarily what this project is. And there's different risks in each project, which you should really be considering. So I'm going to publish the next question. So how do we measure process safety culture? What factors do we consider?
Yeah, so when we measure process safety culture, we have a framework, I guess, of let's call them attributes, but elements or topics that we then drill down into. So, for example, things like awareness. So we measure awareness. How knowledgeable are people actually? Do people even know what process safety is? Do they even have a basic understanding of what process safety is? And it's sometimes surprising that even in companies and amongst groups of people who are clearly facing process safety every day, they may not actually have a very good understanding of what we mean by process safety. That doesn't mean that they're behaving in a way that's unsafe, but they don't really understand what that means, and they don't have the confidence around that. So we would measure sort of familiarity and knowledge, and for example, people's ability to recognize process safety threats and indicators. Would they act if they saw this? Would they? So even though their knowledge they may not believe their knowledge is very good. Would they still act if they saw a process safety hazard or something that is has got potential for an incident? We also measure process safety leadership and supervision. How the organisation is structured in terms of resources and expertise. Worker empowerment is quite a key thing. How people communicate, that's both in terms of reporting incidents and near misses, in terms of sharing learning from incidents, in terms of how we just generally communicate around process safety, and do we share process safety information and performance, so is everybody kept aware? So they're the kind of the soft things, I guess, that we might call. And then we also measure interaction with the harder elements. So maintenance, how well is maintenance being done? Is that well planned and on time? Is there a good asset register, etc.? And then around the processes themselves, so practices and controls, procedures, risk management and risk assessments, and management of change. So there's 10 to 12 elements that we measure, and underneath each of those obviously is a very detailed kind of diagnostic of questions that we ask, but it's pretty comprehensive. If we want a good understanding of what the process safety culture looks like, we do need to take some time and effort to really drill down into those things.
And Caroline, you mentioned before that leadership was one of the ones, if you have a bad or a process safety culture which could be improved. Leadership is one of the areas probably where you should be focusing. Are there any others that come up regular as either strengths or as weaknesses in that we can learn from and improve ourselves without taking a survey? Just something that we can start to work on.
Communication is often key as well. That's often something that is a kind of a strong driver of process safety culture, and indeed processes themselves, and how people interact with those. So the condition of processes, typically you don't need probably a survey in your organisation to realise that quite often procedures are not always in very good condition. They may be out of date, not very comprehensive, not very easy for people to understand, and not even very accessible. And these, this can make life very difficult for people, because if people are not aware of procedural changes and they're working on a piece of kit that has changed, and that ties in with management of change as well, and they're doing something following a out of date procedure, that can be pretty devastating. So quite often we see things like that. Typically can be areas that really need improvement. And,
so basically, sorry.
No, go on. I was going to say
that. Sorry.
No, go on. It's okay.
I'm just going to say that if I was a manager, I could start going to ask the front line about their procedures, how they felt about them. So that would be at least a good first step, even if I couldn't initiate a survey straight away.
Yeah, indeed. So how are people using the procedures? Do they actually know about, the very basic thing is, are people using procedures? Do people know where they can find them? Are they just in people's heads? Are they on an electronic system? Who has access to that system? Do contractors have access to that system? Typically these are barriers that we see. We find that, there may be groups of people who are working alongside direct employees who don't have access to the information that they need, the critical information that they need in order to do the job safely. So I think really make no assumptions about the procedures. The bottom line question is, do you know we have any? Where are they? Can you find them? Do you use them? And I think so the basic, that's the absolute basics. And then if people do use them, are they useful? Do they reflect the real world? How do people update them? Are people empowered to update the procedures, amend the procedures if they find something is not right, no longer reflects the real world? Are people free to make suggestions on how to improve them? Who do they make the suggestions to? Do they talk to their supervisor? Is there some kind of forum for doing that in your organisation? So really, these are maybe not the things that we might ordinarily think of around procedures. Wow, is it that complicated? But quite often it is that complicated.
Yeah, when you bring the human element in, things can get very complicated. So I've got another question from Charlie. People can be as safe as they can be without stopping being productive. So is process safety culture helping here to find that balance? So, how do you find the balance, as you said before, but the balance between being really safe and being productive? Because we know that the only way to be 100% safe is just not to do it, right? Mm-hmm. Just don't drill the well, don't operate the high pressure vessel, don't do it. But obviously we still need to produce. So how do we find that balance? And does this help?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does help, because I think it helps, first and foremost, leadership teams to understand where those gaps are, the glaring gaps, the gaps that push you towards being unsafe in the first instance, and that isn't necessarily about not being productive or cost cutting. There are things that people do unintentionally that make things less safe. A good example, this costs nothing. The example I'm going to give now does not affect productivity at all, but does affect safety. So if somebody wants to raise a concern about process safety, and they take that to their supervisor or their frontline leadership team, and they want to raise it, yeah, it may cost some time to address an issue, but if the response that they get is a roll of the eyes, a glum face, because the supervisor just doesn't want to hear about it, that could mean that was the last time the last time that person is going to raise a concern. So you've now lost your greatest defence against process safety incidents, which is a human being looking out for hazards and looking out for problems, and potentially they may not raise another concern, and so you've potentially lost them, and for what, for some body language that you didn't keep in check. And I think it's those kind of things that when we talk about culture, it is the attitudes, values and behaviours, and really not a lot else. And the behaviour there is that, yeah, you should always welcome the bad news, as it were. You should always be welcoming of that, and sit down and discuss it, and then decide whether it's something that's too costly to do or too difficult to do or can't be done immediately. But to give a bad vibe to the person who comes to raise an issue, potentially that is something that could be very unsafe. And I would say do not underestimate how loud body language is, because it is actually very, very loud, and it can often contradict the words that come out of somebody's mouth. So as a really micro example, I think of that's what when we talk about process safety culture, that's really what we're talking about. We aren't necessarily talking about always big issues, big issues. Yeah, we need to shut down that piece of kit because we missed something, doing routine maintenance. Now we've got to really stop the job, and it's a big issue. Often these things are not big issues, but it's an accumulation of very small issues that will lead to a big problem. So it really is about just kind of stopping, pausing, having a think about how you react and how you behave and what you say, and the consequences of that, both the positive consequences of when you respond to someone well, and the negative consequences potentially when you may unintentionally respond in a way that isn't very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a difficult thing to balance. So I've been to a facility where there had been some sort of careless housekeeping issues, which had resulted in process shutdowns. And so the management team really wanted us to focus on being a little bit more careful about our housekeeping so that we didn't have these shutdowns. But you could, that they had been kept receiving this bad news of, so this happened because so-and-so left this around. So it kept getting this sort of bad news, but the bad news was really actually production related, because nothing and no process safety concern came as a result of those shutdowns. Everything shut down as it should do. It's just that we had an interruption to production, and then we had to start back up. But then I can see how it can be very difficult when you receive the next bad news to detach yourself from that sort of that production bad news which you've been receiving time and time again, say in that year, just because it's what's been happening that year. How do you what advice can you give us to try and be conscious of ourselves, to detach ourselves from that event that might be happening all the time, to still being open to these other bad news?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? That it's not easy, but I just think having some consciousness around that, being aware, making it maybe a topic in every leadership team meeting, just to touch base on those things. What have we done? Again, it goes back to that open and honest culture, really, where we can admit to ourselves and to our colleagues that, actually, you know what, I did do that, and I'm going to reflect on that, and it's okay. It's okay to make those kind of mistakes. But I think, it is a challenge. That it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. But I think just being aware, thinking about it, talking about it, making it a regular subject to talk about these things, I think is really useful.
And have you seen any good practice about what types of meetings? Is it better to talk about process safety in every meeting, or is it better to talk about process safety in a specific sort of targeted meeting? Have you seen anything coming through on the results?
Yeah, it's a bit difficult because we don't always see the results and what people do. Occasionally, sometimes if people have put together a very structured action plan, they'll ask us to have a look at it with them. But I think probably in the first instance, if you perceive that in your organisation process safety is not a very advanced topic, so people are not very aware of that, a few dedicated sessions to give people a chance to become accustomed to the terminology, to feel comfortable about talking about it, bringing some confidence around that will really help, I think, in the first instance. So, making sure that there is a common understanding amongst your staff about what we mean by process safety, and again, what are the expectations around process safety, I think will help. But from there on in, I think it should be, part and parcel. But whether, some ideas we often suggest to people is, process safety learnings and sharings, and asking members of the frontline teams to come and present in their toolbox talk, or whatever systems people have in place, again, so it becomes really normal and natural to talk about process safety for people, so that it's not this really challenging, difficult area of safety that some people just don't feel they know enough about, and therefore, again, you've lost a chance there potentially to fine-tune one of your best barriers, which is to make sure that people not only feel that they know, but feel responsible, feel accountable, believe that they are a critical barrier in preventing process safety incidents.
Yeah, and I think coming back to the what we did as well is just trying to be consistent. So always coming back to, well, what is the hazard, and what is the hazard and the risk, the likelihood associated with this decision? And I found that was a useful way to try and inject a little bit of process safety into almost every conversation that I had. But it was just, so, well, okay, you want to do that, so why can't you do the safer thing? Tell me what the problem, why can't you do that? And then once we know why we can't, we can say, okay, well, yes, well, based on that, the risk is, and so we can do that, or no, I think that's not a good enough reason, or there's not sufficient risk reduction there, so we need to do something else. So just trying to, I don't know, for me it's natural to talk about process safety all the time, but I know it's not natural for a lot of people, and it's a challenge to try and get people to be comfortable with the different terms, because it is a different way of speaking, it's a different way of thinking. Okay, so we're 10 minutes now before the end, and we haven't had any more questions. Is there anything, Caroline, you want to share with us where you thought we might ask but we didn't?
No, I think we've probably covered quite a lot of that. I think the only further observation that we have seen is when people get results of the process safety culture assessment or survey, there is stages of cultural change, no doubt about that. You won't go from where you are today to where you want to be overnight, there's no doubt about that. But what we do tend to see is that there's this kind of spectrum of acceptance, really, and it is quite natural at times when perhaps the results are not what leadership teams expect, to observe some denial, some outright denial. That's not us. Oh, that's just a couple of people. Oh, the data's not right. People didn't understand the question. So that's kind of like, that's often where people can be. They're embarrassed. It's difficult. They may have heard messages that were really frank and candid and very open and honest, and that can be difficult. And then there's kind of soft denial, really, I suppose. Yeah, I hear it, but I don't believe it. I accept that this is what people have said, but somehow their perception is wrong. That's kind of quite often thing. Through then to acceptance. Yeah, I do accept it, and from acceptance, you're well on your way now. If you've got to the point where you can accept the results and accept that this is the perceptions that people have, you can start to take ownership. And once you feel that you own those results, you as a leader, you own those perceptions, or you own at least partly shaping those perceptions, then you can move into action planning. Right, I want to do something about this. I accept this is it. I want to change this, and then really towards full accountability for those actions, and eventually being an absolute champion, championing process safety culture, and really wanting to push that, because you see the benefits of doing that. So there really is this spectrum that we see, and dependent on where people are as individuals, but also as a leadership team, and dependent on the attitude of the most senior leader. They will really often control the response that other members of the leadership team give, and it's really interesting to see where people are. But it's not uncommon to kind of like start off feeling like, yeah, I don't recognize this. I don't recognize these comments. I don't recognize these results. And that is going back to having, courage. It does take a lot of courage to want to do this, because it is a challenge. It is a challenge, but it's a very virtuous thing to do. I think morally it's the right thing to do, and probably financially there are definite benefits from having a good process safety culture, because that usually leads to good process safety performance, which saves you money in the long run.
Yeah, I can't echo that enough. The survey results we had were extremely useful, although we can't discuss what the results were, but the results were extremely useful in driving improvement, and without the survey I don't think I would have been able to improve the way I did. So I can just echo what Caroline said. Knowing what your problem is and how to solve it, because you know what the problem is, that is really the first step. I'm going to put on a feedback survey now. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed the session. And I know you'll be joining us again in a couple of weeks for a session which is a bit earlier in the day for some of our audience, which are in India. So thank you very much. And thank you also for everyone who joined. I really enjoyed the questions. I don't know, Caroline, do you want to add anything?
No, just to say really thank you very much, Louise and Charlie, and also to everyone who's attended tonight. The questions were really, really thoughtful, actually, and did make me have to churn the old grey matter to think about the answers. So yeah, really very useful. Thank you very much.
And next week, if you want to join us, we'll announce the time later in the week, but we'll be discussing organizational change. So I know that could be a very hot topic at the moment, especially with all things financial pressure, etc. maybe that we've mentioned today. There might be a lot of changes happening in your organization. How are you managing those, and how can they impact your process safety performance? So join us next week for that. I'm going to leave the voting open for a minute, but Caroline and I are going to go. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Caroline.
Many thanks, and have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.